All right, hello, biology students. We're going to go over cell structure and function. In this chapter, we're going to specifically looking at organelles and how their structure or their shape is going to determine their function or their job. To start us off, let's just talk a little bit about Robert Hooke and the first identification of cells. Back in the 1600s and before the 1600s, we really didn't know what things were made of or what living things were made of until we started developing these light microscopes. And they were very simple and not very complex. They weren't as powerful as the ones we have today. We can say here's the simple light microscope Robert Hooke was using. And he was observing compartments in a thin slice of cork. If you remember, cork is what like wine. It's what holds in the wine in a wine bottle. It's also like a cork and a cork board. If you have like thumbtacks, you tack a picture to a thumbtack. This is that cork. It's actually bark. If you didn't know, this is bark. And he called these compartments cells. He observed them and he said, hey, they kind of look like the cells or the rooms of a monastery. And these monasteries are where religious people tend to study their religion. And they're kind of like dorm rooms for people in monasteries. And he called them cells then after the cells of a monastery. And from there, he made a lot of other observations. And we'll show you some of these observations he made. You can see these are the cells or the squares of the cork. And this is actually what cork tissue looks like. So he was actually pretty accurate back in the 1600s. From there, he developed something called, and other scientists called, the cell theory. 3 parts of the cell theory are all organisms are made of cells. Cells are the basic unit of living things, and all cells come from pre-existing cells. And these are concepts and statements that are supported by a wide variety of evidence. But just to go over them again, all organisms are made of cells. Everything that's living is made up of at least one or many cells. Cells are the basic unit of living things, so nothing smaller than a cell is considered living. It's the smallest thing that's living. And all cells come from pre-existing cells, either through mitosis, meiosis, or some type of reproduction. 2 different types of cells that we're going to talk about first are eukaryotic and prokaryotic. Eukaryotic cells are much more complex and they contain a nucleus. Prokaryotic cells are less complex and no nucleus. So think pro, no, yes. So eukaryotes are much more complex and have a nucleus. Prokaryotes, less complex, no nucleus. I describe eukaryotic cells are like Tesla cars. They're very complex, and prokaryotic cells are like the Model T or like the cars from like the 1930s. They're very simple and they just had the basics. Eukaryotic cells are large in size. Prokaryotes are smaller in size. You might see here, you might say, hey, this prokaryotic cell is about the same size of a eukaryotic cell. What's going on? This is actually about the size of a prokaryotic cell, much smaller than the eukaryotic cell. DNA is in long strands. We show the chromosome in X form in the eukaryotes, and in the prokaryotes, it's much different and much smaller. It's circular. In eukaryotes, this includes like plant, animal cells. So you are a eukaryotic cell. Bacteria cells are examples of prokaryotic cells. Now, when we talk about organelles, we're talking about like mini organs. So think about your organs in your body and their structure and function. I talk about how the stomach is like a container that contains enzymes that digest your food, and its structure is going to regulate its function. So like your skin is another organ, and it's very different than your stomach. It's because its structure and function is different. So like we have organelles in our body, we have organs in our body, cells are going to have these organelles, and they're going to have specific structures and functions within each cell. The first being cell membrane. This is it says composed of bilayer phospholipids and some proteins. It separates the inner cytoplasm from the outer environment. Function. Membrane regulates the transport of substances in and out of the cell. So this is what the phospholipid bilayer or the membrane of a cell looks like. You can see these phospholipids, which we talked about in the macromolecules chapter. They have a head and 2 like tails, and these are membrane proteins. They do a lot of different functions, but we're just gonna talk about how they regulate what goes into and out of the cell. You can see here, what I would do is I would draw this phospholipid in your notes. You can see this hydrophilic head and these hydrophobic tails here. They are what make up the membrane. There's 2 layers of them. I would also label it hydrophilic and hydrophobic. Okay, so these tails are hydrophobic. This head is hydrophilic. All right, what you can see here is the cell membrane. You can see the phospholipids in 2 different layers here. I always show the students if you make a hand, like you can see this, the tails are on the inside while your knuckles or the heads are on the outside. So whenever you think of the phospholipid bilayer, think of this again. The tails are on the inside, the knuckles, the heads are on the outside. And that's because the tails are going to be hydrophobic, which means they don't like water. So they're going to be hiding from water. And the heads are hydrophilic, which means they like water and they're going to be attracted to it. I describe the membrane as a fluid blanket, so it's not just rigid; it's fluid. It's movable. It's not rigid. Another picture of the phospholipid bilayer. You can see here the tails on the inside, heads on the outside. Lastly, is membrane proteins. Membrane proteins are they're embedded in the phospholipid bilayer, as you can see here. They have many different types of jobs. They can be doors, receptors, enzymes, many more. Mainly, they regulate what goes into and out of the cell. That's their main job. And they're semi-permeable, which means they allow certain things through, but not all. And we're going to talk about that more later on in this chapter. It's called semi-permeable. If something's permeable, you can pass right through. If it's semi-permeable, not everything will pass through it. Some will, some won't. Lastly, before we move on there, lastly, cholesterol. This is just a molecule found within the membrane, and it's going to help keep the membrane fluid, not rigid. So the more cholesterol here, you can see it's going to be more fluid, but this helps with the fluidity of the membrane. Next is the cell wall, and this is found in plant cells, not animal cells. So again, we don't have a cell wall, it's only in plant cells. The structure, it's made of a rigid substance that's actually called cellulose, and this cell wall is outside of the membrane, and it gives support and structure to the cell. It's what makes trees and plants be able to grow really, really tall, but this is added protection and added structure for plants. Again, we find this in plants, not animals. Vacuole, this is like our storage container of the cell. It's large in plants, and there's one of them, and it's smaller in animals. So you can see we have one large one here in plants, very small ones in animals. Function, it contains nutrients for the cell. So this is basically just a storage container of the cell. You can see this large central vacuole in the animal cell, or I'm sorry, in the plant cell. Three main differences between animal and plant cells. One is the chloroplast, two is the cell wall, and three, plants have large central vacuole. Animals only have or have many small vacuoles. All right, another organelle that all cells are going to have are ribosomes, and this creates proteins. This is our place that we're going to manufacture and produce proteins. It's small, circular, and many within one single cell. So there are a ton of these in each cell. The Golgi body, or it's also known as the Golgi apparatus. This is an organelle that modifies, stores, and routes proteins and other materials around the cell. What this is a flat, almost like their membrane containers. They're a little bit different than the vacuoles that we just talked about, but this is like a UPS center. This is going to do all the packaging, and it's going to send materials all around the cell. If you want to send something to like another state, you're going to send it to UPS first, and they're going to send it for you. That's what the Golgi body does. All right, rough and smooth ER. Rough ER. This produces and sends materials to the Golgi body through something called vesicles. Its structure are there's smoother ER and there's rough ER. Smooth ER that is covered with ribosomes is known as rough ER, and it's right next to the nucleus here. Smooth ER, on the other hand, produces lipids and things like phospholipids and cholesterol and sends them to the Golgi body by vesicles. They're a long, again, network of tubes that also have a nucleus that's also has a membrane that's connected to the nucleus. Next is the cytoplasm, and this is the aqueous or the solution within the cell. All cells have a cytoplasm. So all cells will have a cell membrane, all cells will have a cytoplasm, and all cells will have some type of genetic material as well. But the first here is the cytoplasm. This is just almost like a liquid that's in the cell. Its function is to kind of hold all the other organelles together, and it's just like the container. It's just what's in the cell. It's just a liquid that's in the cell. Now, going forward, we are going to be looking at differences between animal and plant cells. There are similarities, there are differences. There are a lot of similar organelles, but there are also some different organelles that are found in only plant versus only animal cells. Let's talk about the nucleus. The nucleus is a circular membrane-bound organelle. You can see here is our nucleus. It has its own membrane. So this, your cell membrane is one membrane. This nucleus is also going to have its own membrane. This houses all the genetic code. This is where all of your DNA is going to be found, and it controls all the actions of the cell. How I describe this is it's kind of like the control center of the cell. You can see here it's another cell here. We have the nucleus, which is circular, and it's the control center of the cell. Mitochondria. This is the kind of like the power plant of the cell. The running joke online is that it's the powerhouse of the cell. I don't like that term, but if you remember it, it's okay. But I want you to understand this generates energy from the breakdown of food. That's its function, its structure. There are two membranes, and the inner membrane's folded, and it's just there's a lot of different enzymes in here working. But it's found in almost all eukaryotic cells, but not found in prokaryotic cells. Both plant and animal have this you can see here, the mitochondria. Another image of it. Chloroplast, location of photosynthesis. This is where we convert solar energy into chemical energy stored in glucose and other carbohydrates. This also produces some ATP, which we'll talk about later on. But it also has a double membrane, contains pigments, and it's green in color. Here's a chloroplast. We'll talk more about these later on this year. The last couple organelles we're going to talk about are lysosomes. They break down food vacuoles, damaged organelles, and even dead cells. What this organelle does, it's kind of like the custodial worker or the janitor of the cell. It cleans up and just breaks things down. And it's a structure that contains digestive enzymes. And these guys just break things down in the cell. The cytoskeleton, this is a protein structure within the cell. You can see the cytoskeleton here of a cell, but it stretches from membrane to membrane, and it gives support to the cell. So this is kind of like your skeleton. The cell has an inner working protein network that just gives its own structure to the cell. Oh, I guess that's it. Thought I had one more. Oh, yeah, we do have one more. Here we go, vesicles. I knew we had three. Vesicles, these are membrane-bound organelles. They are like the UPS truck. That's the analogy I give. They are the transporters of the cell, and they go to and enter the Golgi body and then leave the Golgi body. These are the actual messengers that send materials around the cell. They're called vesicles.